the first area that I'd like to talk to you about is what's happened since October 7th and the events that have been going on. You've been very vocal, and I've had the opportunity to follow your work specifically on LinkedIn and the posts you make. And I find that you have very thoughtful responses to what's going on. And you wrote a great article about some of the events that have taken place and the anti-Semitism. Would you mind covering some of the work that's gone on since October 7th?
Sure. And it's a challenging issue. I have to say that, what we've witnessed on the streets in Canada and frankly around the world is something that I must admit I never would have imagined. I can appreciate that there are different perspectives on what's taking place in Israel and in Gaza right now. I have my own. I know there are others who may have a different view, but to see the spillover of anti-Semitism and hate onto the streets in Canada, online in Canada, to see it in many other places where I'm a member of the Jewish community, and to see so many in the Jewish community really put at risk with the kinds of activities and targets that we've seen at Jewish community centers, at schools, at Jewish-owned businesses, at various communities, at hospitals, sometimes disingenuously claimed that it's not the target, although it just certainly feels like it's not random. And I don't think we've seen leaders step up in the way that we ought to have seen. And there seems to be, not only is there little stopping it, but if anything, it continues to accelerate. And what becomes seemingly for some acceptable or normal just continues to escalate in a way that, as I say, I must admit, I never really thought would have been imaginable in a country like ours.
Can you help us understand this issue from your perspective? Because I look at it as a First Nations person, and if some of the things that you've posted about that have been put out about Jewish people were done about First Nations people, we would be putting in new laws. We would be working incredibly hard. I feel like there would be rallies, there would be protests, there would be an overwhelming response to some of the things that have been said. And it's been shocking for me to watch because, again, if I put myself in that circumstance and if it said a different name other than a Jewish person, I imagine that the response would be incredibly overwhelmingly strong and politicians would be coming out. What is going on? Why is there this difference?
Yeah, I feel the same way you do. I say that as a Jewish person, but I think back to, the kinds of issues that have arisen where different communities have felt targeted and needed support over the years, whether that was Black Lives Matter, whether that was issues around reconciliation that we've seen, and what we learned about broadly for many of us around residential schools and the desire to step up, whether it's some of the misogyny that we've seen take place at times where women have been targets, and it feels like communities have come together. And in this instance, almost from day one, almost from October 8th, the Jewish community has felt targeted. I realize that there are differences of opinion about Israel's response to what was the worst massacre in since the Holocaust for the Jewish community, and I don't think it should surprise anyone that the Jewish community is still reeling from that. Israel still reeling from that, has responded. And there, as I say, there are different views about that response. But regardless, the targeting of the community, at times simply using the term Zionist for the kind of language that frankly would have never been acceptable. I mean, to talk about Jewish doctors and Jewish lawyers or Jewish politicians in ways that, has strong anti-Semitic notions and connotations, oftentimes directly anti-Semitic, and to think that it's okay, but I called them a Zionist instead. I personally think is wrong. And for years there's been debate around what's known as the IRA definition, a definition dealing with anti-Semitism, and one of the concerns was that it might limit the ability to criticize Israel, even as one does not intend to be anti-Semitic. And the IRA definition sought to make the case that at times that some of those criticisms do go over the line. And, I must admit, there were times where I wasn't really sure where I would fall on that, but to see what I've seen over the last number of months highlights that I actually think that the concerns that were expressed through that definition, I think actually were entirely accurate. And as I say, we see speech, we see threats, we see activities that I think you're right, targeted at any other community would have been both unacceptable. Leaders would not be afraid to speak out. They would be kind of lining up at the podium to speak out. And I think we would see law enforcement and other community leaders being far more aggressive in seeking to ensure that, frankly, that all Canadians, regardless of their perspectives on these kinds of issues, feel safe. And that's, frankly, something that where we are not at right now in Canada.
I'm sorry to ask you to do this, but I do imagine that some of my listeners don't keep up with the news to the same extent. They may not have a full grasp of what took place on October 7th. Would you feel comfortable somewhat summarizing the events that took place that day? You mentioned that it's right up there with the Holocaust. Would you mind, just for those individuals who might not have kept up with it or understood the gravity of the situation?
Right. Well, to be clear, it is not right up there with the Holocaust. Holocaust involved the mass murder of 6 million Jews and another million or more of other ethnicities, but it was the Jewish community that was the most targeted. And in my case, it was quite literally many members of my family were wiped out. This was not that, to be absolutely clear. But it was the largest number of Jews that were killed in a single day since the Holocaust. Right. And in that instance, Hamas, a known terrorist organization, registered as a terrorist organization in Canada, came in from the Gaza Strip into Israel and engaged, frankly, in activities, in barbaric activities that remain unimaginable. Killing whole families, killing children in front of the parents, and then killing the parents, burning many of those individuals, engaging in now confirmed yet again by a UN official, engaging in sexual assault, rape of some of the very worst kind, targeting both kibbutzim, these communities that were located near the Gaza Strip, targeting a music festival, the Nova Music Festival, and there were victims from many different parts of the world. It wasn't just people from Israel, and then alongside that, taking several hundred hostages, and there are still over 100 hostages that are still there. And when we talk about hostages, we're in some instances quite literally talking about babies, talking about elderly women, and to, under any circumstance, we would see that as just an act of terror that is almost without parallel in terms of our thinking. I mean, we tend to think back to 9/11, and yet the scale, particularly relative to the size of Israel, was so much more dramatic. The barbarism that took place was so much more dramatic. And so, from my perspective, unsurprisingly, Israel has taken a position that simply can't happen again, and that the perpetrators of that, Hamas, who embed themselves within communities, within civilians, has to be destroyed. I mean, they simply can't have that capability to do that again.
That is a lot to take in, and I somewhat don't want to get into the whataboutisms about what's actually going on in the conflict, and I know that there's more expert voices on those topics than I could ever provide, or questions that could be asked that I wouldn't be able to go to those depths on, so I don't really want to get into the conflict. But people here in Canada have really nothing to do with what's going on over there. Jewish people living their life with their families, they're not involved in that conflict in a direct way. And so they deserve peace, happiness, the pursuit of happiness. They deserve to be able to live a normal life. And it seems like they're being targeted and they're not involved. Would you mind explaining why Canadians are being targeted when they're so far from the conflict here in Canada?
Right. Well, there are people, both, of course, who were left reeling from October 7th and responded to that. There are people who have seen the response, and obviously it's been awful to see what has taken place in Gaza since. It's tragic to see the amount of death that's taken place, and want that to stop. I'd submit the way to make that stop is for Hamas to stop. But nevertheless, I understand there are strong perspectives on all sides when it comes to this particular issue. But rather than targeting with protests, and of course protests are legit as long as they don't bleed into violence and other unlawful activities, but making one's views known, to the Israeli government via a consulate or an embassy, to the Canadian government via Parliament Hill or other places to sort of try to influence their views on this, strike me as wholly legitimate. But one of the things that we have seen is targeting, as I say, we've seen shots fired at Jewish schools, graffiti and other violence at Jewish community centers, targeted vandalism at Jewish-owned businesses, really echoes of frankly of the Holocaust, of Nazi Germany when we saw some of those take place. I'm not saying this is Nazi Germany, but there are certainly echoes in terms of kind of how Jews have been targeted in this way. I think that happens, of course, because Israel is identified as the one state that has been representative of the Jewish people, and so Jews are seen as somehow responsible for this. It does seem to me that much of what takes place is really almost this flowering of anti-Semitism that may have been latent, that may not have been as visible for a long period of time, but I guess I have a hard time believing that surely some of this must have been there before, and this has provided for some at least a convenient excuse to exercise some of those views.
What is anti-Semitism from your perspective?
Well, anti-Semitism to me is really understood right now as targeting Jews and Jewish community as Jews. It's in some instances targeting that, treating them in an unfair or biased manner. It is vilifying them. It is engaging, frankly, in hate towards the community. And as I say, in some of the protests, we see some of that taking place in ways that are I know for my community, very scary.
You mentioned that some of this not all of this started after October 7th, that this somewhat existed prior. Why do you think that is? How do you process that as a person? Like, I again put myself in the shoes of, like, I'm a First Nations person, and so if people hated me, I'd be like, well, like, what? Like, if there was this dislike, I can't imagine it in any other circumstance, and it makes me uncomfortable to think that this has existed and continues to exist. It's just hard for my brain to even wrap myself around this concept.
Well, listen, I mean, anti-Semitism is one of the oldest forms of hatred in many ways. I mean, Jews have been facing this for literally millennia as we've gone through periods gone from community to community, rarely having a space that was a protected space, and oftentimes being driven from different kinds of communities, viewed as the other. And obviously there's many communities that face some of that. I think it's important to recognize Jewish communities exist in communities around the world. This is not just sort of European white communities, but more than half of Israel are people that are coming from different parts of the Arab world or the Middle East, from Africa, from other parts in the world. It is a true melting pot in many respects in terms of people coming from a great many different places. And the fact that this has been something that has recurred again and again and again is also, I think, is hard for me to wrap my brain around. And I feel, as someone privileged to have been born and raised in Canada, although the descendant of Holocaust survivors, that I felt that much of this was put behind us. That there's a safety in Canada. That this was gone. But I must admit, post October 7th has been a wake up call, I think, for many. That in fact, it seems that for each generation, the Jewish community will often face some of these issues, and it feels like we're facing it yet again.
You mentioned in one of your articles that politicians have remained relatively silent on this issue. Would you mind elaborating?
Sure. It's, listen, and I think you did a nice, you made, I think, appropriate comment to say that, if this had targeted other communities, I think that that politicians would not be reticent to speak out. And I think too often they have been in this case. I think in the early instances, there was an attempt to sort of just frame this broadly as, please don't engage in hate, try to create equivalencies that I don't think were there, especially early on, where I think the Jewish community has been really the target. I think there's been Islamophobia as well. And I think we need to speak out against that as well. But I mean, the sheer numbers tell us quite clearly that the Jewish community, oftentimes a very, very small part of a community, are often the most targeted community for hate crimes in city after city across Canada. And I think our federal politicians have often not spoken clearly and unequivocally in the way that they could and should. And I think the same is true often in our local communities. It's often the mayors, chiefs of police that we look to. I mean, there are some laws on the books. We can debate about the application of those laws, but what should be beyond debate is that we require and need community leaders to step up. We need people who are not Jewish to step up and speak out as well. And there certainly have been many that have, but I can tell you candidly that I know that there are many people that feel a sense of betrayal, that they may have been active, the Jewish community stood side by side on other issues, and yet there has been relative silence at times when it comes to this issue. And that's it's certainly discouraging, and it's a little bit hard to take.
David Eby, our premier here in British Columbia, has just come out and said that he's going to end anti-Semitism in, it sounds like, our province, which is ambitious to say the least. But this is after one of the cabinet ministers just stepped down, saying that the provincial government wasn't doing enough. Do you have any perspectives on kind of the response to the lack of response?
Listen, Celine Robinson, who's I know the former cabinet minister that you're talking about, acknowledged that what she had said was wrong, apologized for it. I think we have seen many instances where politicians say things that may have been a mistake. We've seen it on these issues on a number of occasions, and those apologies have, when they've been forthcoming, they've often been accepted. In the case of the one most prominent active Jewish minister in that government, it apparently wasn't enough. And, I think she went and burned down the house a little bit on her way out by making clear how she had felt, how she had been treated, and the challenges that she had faced as a Jewish member of cabinet. And so I'm happy that the Premier Eby says he's going to address anti-Semitism. I don't think he is going to end it in the way that no one's been able to end it. But it does feel like it comes late, and it comes having failed to address what was a recurring issue that was clearly evident, at least to one of his most notable members of cabinet, and nothing happened until it was, in a sense, too late.
How do you feel about the federal government's response, Justin Trudeau's response? It does seem like it's very hard to figure out where they stand on the war right now and what their actual position is.
It is. It is hard. It feels like, well, in some ways it feels that it's easy. It feels that it's driven primarily by electoral calculations as opposed to core principles. And I can appreciate that the government may have, is trying to balance a number of perspectives when it comes to the war. But I don't think there's anything to balance when it comes to dealing with clear signs of hate. And it's discouraging when we see leaders, that includes the Prime Minister, sort of fall back on the line that, this isn't us, this isn't Canadians. It turns out it is. It turns out that this is part of what we see in Canada, and it requires real leadership from all leaders, including the Prime Minister, to try to do something about it.
Brilliant. Did you see the comments made by Claudine Gay at the congressional hearing?
Yes, I certainly did.
Do you have any thoughts that you'd be able to share on her response to questions about anti-Semitism and her leadership's response?
Yeah. I mean, I watched that clip, I think, over and over and over again, because I couldn't quite believe what I was hearing. And I realize there are elements of theater to all of that, but, the seeming inability of university presidents to take an unequivocal stand against the calling for genocide, which I believe was the gist of the question, was just mind-boggling. And I know that Jewish community Jewish students on many campuses, both in the United States and some in Canada, have not felt safe, and at times the campuses and university leaders have been slow to respond as well. And it's, of course, we see future leaders are coming out of there, and we're left to wonder a little bit how there isn't the ability to speak clearly on that issue as well. to be clear, academic freedom is absolutely essential, and people should be able have protection in that regard. But that doesn't extend necessarily to say certainly anything you like in a classroom environment that leaves people feeling unsafe, and even more just generally, it seems to me that we in the academic world, with my own university, have made a point of emphasizing the need for robust discussion and debate, but within a safe space where everyone feels comfortable and treated with respect. And I feel that has at times, I'm not going to say that that's at my institution, but I will say that there certainly have been institutions where we know that there are students, faculty members that don't feel safe.
There's this incoherence that I'm having trouble squaring in regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion, safe spaces, anti-bullying rules, like all of these initiatives that speak to this idea that we need to be able to do all of this work in a good way. Everybody deserves to be represented. We should make space for everyone in the room. And a lot of those initiatives are pushed forward in the interests of the Black community, Indigenous people, minority groups. And then it seems like that all went out the window with Claudine Gay's testimony. Like, it just did not seem like I couldn't see the consistency among all of these initiatives that I hear about all the time. And then these comments seem to not be consistent with any of that all of a sudden.
I must admit, it feels that way to me as well. I'm a supporter of those initiatives. I feel that we've done, and we need to continue to do more to ensure inclusivity rather, and opportunity for all. And at times there have been communities that have not had those opportunities. And so I see it certainly in my own institution, and I'm glad that we have tried to make efforts to ensure that we can include as many different perspectives and voices, and try to have faculty and student bodies that are more reflective of the diversity of our country, which I think is one of the great things that we have. But at the same time, I am at times left to wonder why, when it comes to some of the initiatives designed to ensure a comfort level for all, that somehow Jews don't seem to count. And I don't understand why.
I don't understand why either, but you did make an amazing post. It didn't end up airing on the Super Bowl, I don't think, but it was this amazing video about how this can be addressed. And it was of this woman with her child heading out, coming home and seeing an anti-Semitic trope on their garage wall, and then their neighbor, while they were out, coming and cleaning off and repainting and fixing it. And it was that reminder for me that one person can make a difference, that this is addressable at the ground level over time if we come together and we start to work together to be proud of all ethnicities, all cultures, all values, and work towards uplifting the best of ourselves. And I loved that, because that's really what this podcast is about. It's thinking bigger than yourself and being proud of other people and standing by them and doing it when you might not get the recognition, but moving the world in that direction. What did that ad mean to you?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And thank you for this podcast that you are taking that perspective and airing those issues. I'm really grateful. And I agree with you. That ad, I think for those in the Jewish community, this is a lived experience, so they recognize it. But, as I think this conversation is highlighting, you're doing a great job of highlighting the fact that there are many that don't see this. And, the Super Bowl, I suppose, provided an opportunity to bring this to attention of obviously a large audience. It's one of the largest television audiences of the year. And I think those kinds of initiatives at trying to educate are critically important. And we're at a time that feels, I must admit, pretty dark right now. It's really difficult, but at the same time, seeing other communities come forward to say this is wrong and wishing to speak out and to educate others about why it's wrong provides a bit of light about potential way forward.
And just to share my personal perspective, as like an Indigenous person to this land, I feel like when we're having these conversations in Canada, when we talk about reconciliation and coming back together, I think we need to appreciate that people have come over to this country for a very long time and we have been welcoming. And I know people like to take the trope that we didn't want those outsiders or there were those early issues. We wouldn't have Métis people if there wasn't some camaraderie among people coming here as immigrants and moving here and coming together. We wouldn't have that distinct culture. And I think they are a symbol of us coming together, breaking bread, and sharing the best of ourselves. And I think that should be highlighted, but we should also work towards that into the future, that the best of us come to this country and we work hard and we share our gifts and our uniqueness. And that's what enriches our culture. It strengthens our social fabric. It makes it a more interesting place. And this is one of my favorite places I've gotten to travel, but I'm so proud to come from here. And when I see this news, it's frustrating. And when I see a leader not standing up against hate, discrimination, disrespect, anti-Semitism, it's hard to watch, because that's not my Canada. That's not the values that we stood on 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And that's not the way forward that's going to make us stronger. It makes us more vulnerable. It makes us more divisive, less clear on issues, and less willing to trust each other in the grocery store. And that's just not a Canada that I want to live in. It's not a province I want to live in. It's not a community I want to live in. I want anybody to be able to come forward on issues and us to hear them out and work towards solutions, no matter how small, because that's what makes us trust the system, other people. When you go in and you're doing your taxes or you're going to your accountant, you want to know that you're going to have that good rapport. And when people don't get that, that makes them feel disconnected from the community. And that's not how you want people to feel when we're talking about mental health, wellness, and living a full and meaningful life. And so having your post is a constant reminder that I can play a role in this, that I can be a leader on these issues in ways small and big, to try and push issues forward and make sure that we have constructive conversations. So I appreciate all of the posts you made about that.
Oh, thank you for that, and thank you for those thanks. But even more, thank you for what you just said. That's a vision of Canada that I entirely agree with. This is, I too have traveled a lot, and I always come home, and I come home because this is a country that has so much to offer, and I've long believed that diversity is truly our strength, perhaps the most important strength that we have. I see it in my classrooms. I see it in my communities, and it makes it particularly painful when one group within those communities are left to feel unsafe and targeted in the way that we've seen, and when at times leaders don't step up to try to preserve and affirm the very best in Canada, which at times I don't feel like that we've seen enough of, at least from some of our leaders.